Welcome to this very special MOOC of the Center for Civil Society on a very critical period of Indian history, the emergency. Now, as a historian, I look at history in two different ways. And indeed, if you want to look at history, you can look at it in two different ways. One, of course, is something happened in the past, and you go and look at it, you study it academically or otherwise, and you draw certain understandings for it. But it's firmly something that happened in the past. It doesn't have a great relevance into your lives as you lead it today, or as you lead it today. The other way of looking at history, of course, is when you realize that an incident that happened in the past is really alive among you today. It has a direct influence, it has a direct potency to affect your life as you lead it today. And the emergency, what we're going to discuss, those 21 critical months between 1975 and 1977. In fact, between June 1975 and March 1977, those critical months are of the second type. The reason why we must look at the emergency today is because it has direct bearing on how we understand liberty, freedom, those unique and, should I say, nebulous concepts, and how they impact us, enrich our lives today. Now, what was the emergency? Well, very simply put, the emergency was a period when civil liberties and democracy as we understand it was removed from India via a constitutional decree. The President of India of that time signed a decree, in a sense, which under the constitution gave the government emergency powers, or powers that went beyond the natural course of democratic sort of churn and made it a quasi-authoritarian rule. In this period, in fact, only one person had the right to determine what happened in India. And it's very important to understand what that nepotism can do. Because often when we talk about nepotism, we think, well, you know, this is the way it is in the subcontinent, and it happens in other parts of the world too. You know, you have a political leader, their children also come to acquire powers and so on and so forth. But the emergency teaches us what kind of virulent potency and what kind of impact on civil liberties and personal freedom this kind of nepotism can actually have. And I will go into more detail as we speak. Let me first talk about another very interesting thing. Remember, when a president signed this decree, this was a unilateral decision. It wasn't a decision that had been debated even within the Congress party. In fact, many scholars would argue that most of the Congress party, including Mrs. Indira Gandhi's own cabinet ministers, were not very aware of what she was about to do. And it happened because already power was so concentrated in the hands of Mrs. Indira Gandhi as Prime Minister that she was able to, in a sense, call it coax, call it persuade, call it cajole, you choose the word you want, but she was able to impress upon the President of India that this needs to be done. Another critical thing right at the beginning must be said. Only hours after this decree was signed, late in June 1975, within hours, more than 600 political opponents and political activists had been arrested around the country. Let's pause for a moment here and understand what that really means. What that means is the emergency isn't something that happened because of external pressures in a moment, as it were, of emergency. The emergency was not an emergency. It was premeditated. It was pre-planned. These lists had already been drawn up. Mrs. Gandhi was clearly very clear who were her main political opponents. And therefore, within hours of the final decree being signed, these people were all, in a sense, hunted down by police forces and put behind bars. Now pause here once again. Why is the emergency so potent for us even today? Because of this one idea of political opposition. when we talk about freedom and liberty, remember, true freedom and liberty does not actually operate in isolation or vacuum. This is the most interesting thing to understand about civil liberties and freedom. Your freedom is actually validated every day via opposition. What do I mean by that? What I mean is the fact that you are free to say whatever you want to say is validated by the fact that somebody else who does not agree with you also has the liberty and the freedom to say whatever they want, even if it's in opposition to you. If you take away that opposition, if you eradicate that opposition, if you eliminate that opposition and put it behind bars, then that complete sense, surely Mrs. Gandhi would have felt completely free in that moment, free from opposition. But that was in a sense, the death knell to the regular practice of democracy. Because the citizen, in fact, became much less free in that moment. The citizen lost their freedom in that moment. Because the potency or the liberty to oppose, which is a very critical part of democracy, went away. The other thing that is very important and is embedded in what I just said, the use of the police force. When you take away civil liberties like this, as was done during the emergency, what happens is that there is a direct flow of power from the executive to the police force, which is the determining boots on the ground, so to speak, of the actual wielding of power. And once you take away any opposition to the use of this power, then the authoritarian state can operate using directly such a police force, not only against their own opposition leaders or political activists who oppose them, but in fact, as we will see in just a bit, also against the citizen themselves. Remember, and that's why it's really important to remember in this idea of liberty and freedom, that if you don't oppose when somebody else's liberty is being taken away, very soon those powers come to your doorstep to take away your civil liberties, your freedom too. There is no such thing in a democracy that you remain quiet when somebody else's freedom is taken away. I think emergency's great lesson lies in the fact that this rollout of power that Mrs. Gandhi did began with her own political opponents and very quickly came down to the common citizen. In this MOOC on the emergency period of India, that period of authoritarianism within India's long history, modern history and democracy, we're going to talk a little bit about what happened before and what happened after those 21 critical months between 1975 and 1977. What led to the declaration of emergency? Now remember, this is very important to understand, because you have to understand, how does authoritarianism really creep into a society? Actually, in 1971, Mrs. Gandhi was on a big high. The Indian army had just facilitated the creation of Bangladesh. She had been hailed almost as a goddess in some quarters. It was a great victory. But very soon, it became clear that her administration was steeped in deep corruption, and protests began from various quarters. There was a court judgment which invalidated her election and also barred her from participating in elections for a certain period of time. Now, all of this happened very quickly, even as Jayaprakash Narayan, an old Gandhian leader, a leader in the Gandhian mold, who had in fact retired. He was a tall leader in the freedom struggle and had retired, but came back from retirement, in a sense, to lead this protest against Mrs. Gandhi and her inept, corrupt governance. Every day, it seemed, in that period leading up to the declaration of emergency, there was a new protest bursting out from a new quarter. There was a massive march very close to the declaration of emergency on the streets of Delhi. Jayaprakash Narayan even called onto all the administrative forces, including the security forces, to practice the old freedom struggle principle of civil disobedience against an inept, corrupt, or what he called an inept, corrupt government. All of this was almost like a perfect storm. And here's the thing you must remember. When all these protests are happening democratically, if an administration, if a government is not responding or is inadequately responding, then there are always chances that there is a move or there is a tendency towards authoritarianism. Because what is the fundamental principle of democracy? The principle of democracy is that if there are mass protests, then it is incumbent upon the administration to respond effectively to those protests. If an administration does not do that and doesn't do it for a long period of time, there are always chances that they are not listening to the people who voted them in power and indeed are moving towards authoritarianism. This is a sign I think is vital that we must pick up from the history of emergency, which is applicable to citizens today, to each of us today as citizens. The other thing to remember, the President of India signed the decree. Now, you may say, some may say he was persuaded, some may say he was coaxed, some may say he was pressured, but finally he did it. He was a prominent congressman himself. So this idea that a so-called neutral agency of the government finally bends to the will of one person and indeed one party is something to be very, very wary of. Because if a party or a strong leader manages to push in their people in every arm of the government, in a moment of crisis, that institution is likely not going to stand up for democracy, but will stand up for the people who put them in power. And the president signed that decree. The other thing, very, very important, you may wonder, if such a period of authoritarianism was rolled out and people were already protesting about inefficiencies, about corruption, how come masses of people did not come on the streets and protest? Well, here's the interesting thing. When an authoritarian regime does something like this, they usually offer a trade-off, a barter, something in exchange for your civil rights. And that sometimes confuses, if not convinces, some citizens. And that's what happened during the emergency. What did Mrs. Gandhi come and say? She said, well, I will give you good governance. Now that is an extremely interesting trade-off. She said, I will make the trains run on time. I will clean the streets. I will remove poverty. A great promise in a country inundated by poverty. Now, here's the sensible citizen response to such a trade-off. Why, we must ask, were all these things not happening anyway? After all, she was an elected leader. She should have been delivering trains on time and removal of poverty and better governance and the cleaning of streets anyway. Why did it have to have authoritarian rule for all these things to happen? Now, this trade-off, these questions, the asking of these questions are a vital part of democracy. And if these things disappear, the asking of the questions themselves disappear, then there is no democracy. The other thing, very important, remember hours after the president signed that decree, signed that order establishing the rules for emergency or putting the country under emergency, which meant that the government was no longer confined by any opposition, Parliament became suspended and it could pass whatever laws it wanted. In fact, the power became confined in the hands, as I've said before, of two people. Not even the full Congress party, two people. The incumbent Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and, even more critically, her unelected son, a son who had no official role, a son who had no official power, Sanjay Gandhi. That was the most critical thing, who took a whole set of decisions. Now, very importantly, if the emergency was declared one would imagine that it would take time to be rolled out. But hours after the emergency was declared, hours, more than 600 opposition leaders and activists were arrested. More than 600. What does that tell us? It tells us that authoritarianism is usually premeditated by the people who roll it out. Obviously, these lists had been created long before this rollout happened. So the moment it was declared, the security forces, now completely under the control of one person and one family, went across the country and arrested all opposition leaders, all opposition political activists. Now, this swift mechanism of silencing all opposition is a hallmark of authoritarianism. A major rollout happened of what is known in Nasbandi, what is known in Hindi as Nasbandi. In English, we would call it vasectomy, essentially forced family planning. Now remember, there is a very interesting history to this. India had been struggling with this idea of family planning for a long time. Even though Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi's father, actually is on record saying that he actually believed that more than family planning, the best kind of family planning is economic development. Because as people get wealthier, they tend to have less children. But there were other thoughts, other people who felt that people had to go through forced contraception, forced vasectomies to stop them from having children. Now, during emergency, here's the terrible thing that happened. There were targets set of how many people, how many men in fact, had to undergo vasectomy. And they were supposed to be induced, convinced, lured to go through this process. In fact, as it often happens under authoritarian governments, if you give the government this kind of coercive power, it finally always becomes coercive. And again, across many states of India, in their enthusiasm to meet the targets, already the target was quite high, but many states in their enthusiasm to show how devoted they were to Mrs. Gandhi, and especially to Sanjay Gandhi, they wanted to, supersede and exceed that target, right? And hundreds and thousands of young men were dragged out and under coercion had to undergo vasectomy. Here's the most important thing to understand. We must always remember the history of the emergency as a dark period in Indian history because it showed us with stark sunlight, as it were, what happens when authoritarianism comes and how it finally, if you start to make a trade-off with authoritarianism, it will finally take over not just your civil liberties, but your very bodily self. This is the prime thing to understand, that the history of the emergency teaches us that our so-called liberty upon our very self, our body, is not enshrined anymore when authoritarianism comes. This is the vital, this history, and later there was a commission set up whose report came out and a lot of people understood how many people across the country had gone through forced family planning, had gone through forced vasectomies. Now, we have to pause to understand what kind of people do you think in this history of the emergency were the people who actually were made to undergo this vasectomy? Almost always, these were poor people. So you see, the promise may be that we will remove poverty, but what actually transpired in many cases was the removal of the unborn poor. Not just the removal of the poor, but the removal of the unborn poor. The poor who had not been born also. And that's not it. In many cases, including in the capital New Delhi, large number of slums were moved out of the city in the name of beautifying and cleaning and removing poverty. Well, that wasn't the removal of poverty, that was the removal of the poor. We must remember the history of emergency in our country because it teaches us that if we make a trade-off, if we make an exchange with authoritarianism, which promises us better governance and quote-unquote the removal of poverty, finally it becomes the removal of the poor. That's why the only thing that can truly remove poverty is economic freedom.